Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. It's going to be such an exciting conversation about agentic risk. And I feel like it's such a timely conversation. It's a conversation that I have with a lot of people, but I'm really excited to have it with you, Terry. So I'll give you just a quick minute to introduce yourself and then we'll dive in.
Well, thanks, Hannah. It's great to be here. I'm Terry O'Daniel. I am a builder turned security expert, and I've spent a lot of time building out security programs at large tech companies like Salesforce and Netflix. And I've also run my own security teams at Instacart and Amplitude. And now I do a lot of investing and advising in early stage startups. And I am fascinated by the shift. This is one of maybe the fourth major technological shift I've been through in the move to AI and agentic AI. And I'm fascinated to have this conversation about how do we as CISOs really manage the risk around AI?
So, in my role as Chief AI Officer at Geordie, it's something that I talk about all the time, not just with prospects, but also with people in the security industry who are just trying to get their hands around this because it is such a big change, right? It's a paradigm shift. So, what is the difference, would you say, between agentic risk and all the other cyber risk that we're used to dealing with, that we have mechanisms for? However effective those mechanisms are, we have mechanisms for them, but what's the key difference for you?
Well, when I was a builder and now as a CISO, I have always been a massive fan of automation. And we've always had automation available to us, be it bash scripts or cron tabs or whatever. But some CISOs I speak with they're stuck between curious and confused about agentic AI specifically. I think everyone's sort of come to grips with the commercial LLM revolution and the exposure to that. But what's new is the behavior. I think traditional software and automation principles have always been there to execute instructions for us. But what has changed now is that agentic systems are making decisions and taking actions. And that's where the shift in the risk model becomes really important to us as CISOs.
I agree. And I think something that comes up a lot is we've had so much information pushed toward us around how large language models work and what the risks are there, which is largely data orientated. So how can I make sure that the wrong data doesn't end up in the wrong place? And how do I make sure that the users are using this in the best way possible? But it really is a change when it comes to agents because it's a new type of actor, right? It's not a human user, but it's also not traditional software. And so you have this delegated decision authority in this new
Mhm.
type of digital worker, but you're also having to account for activities that previously you didn't have to account for and on protocols that you haven't seen before. So it really is a step change from what we've seen from large language models and how we secure those and the best practices. Even though many agents use large language models as their reasoning core, the way that they choose tools, the way that they interpret human requests or responses is really,
Mhm.
really different from a standard kind of chatbot flow. So when we talk about, chatbots and their difference, how do you then bring it a little deeper into traditional software? Because what's the difference between how we secure traditional software and agents?
I think the way I see it is in traditional risk, you're looking at you're looking at code, right? Code is the source of all these things. And the code tends to have defined execution paths. It has boundaries. Um, it is triggered ultimately by a human making a decision, whether that's to write a cron tab and like automate something at a certain timing or to actually execute a script. And those systems, they may not always work as they're supposed to, but they tend to behave predictably. And that gives us a framework in which to manage the risk. Um, Often, if I deal with an auditor who comes in and says, we need to look at your code and we need to validate that certain things work as intended, they can rely on the fact that if it executes once and the code enforces that, then they're sort of done. And I think what's changed here with agentic risk is that since the systems are deciding when to act rather than a human, that changes the sort of first principles. The the fact that those systems can call other tools, including LLMs, as you mentioned, the fact that they can operate across different systems. So since, as I mentioned before, that there's a behavioral change that we have to account for in the risk model. That behavior emerges from prompts and memory and in the environment itself. And that's much broader than just looking at a code base, looking at the associated pipelines, the build to deploy pipelines and things like that, and calling it a day.
Yeah, 100%. And I also talk a lot about the difference between automation and autonomy because it's a really, really key difference. So, when we talk about traditional software, what we're really looking at is a series of pre made decisions. They're already
Mhm.
decided, they're hard coded, and they follow logic flows. So, you're just executing that decision over and over, which means if you sandbox it in 6 months, unless there's a crazy vulnerability that is not discovered in the code, you should have roughly the same performance. It's repeatable, it's expected. But with agents, they're making decisions in real time. And that's the autonomy angle that's really different. So the decision layer isn't happening from the coding perspective, it's happening as actions unfold, which means you have to worry about stepwise change. You have to worry about in the moment calls, boots on the ground
Mhm.
decisions from these agents, which means that even if you do the same thing, you sandbox them for 6 months, they could do something completely different the first day in production than they have done in that sandbox, which makes the challenge all the more important, especially when you think about the value that they provide. Because the answer isn't just, well, then let's make them deterministic. The problem is non determinism. Let's turn them back, wave our magic wands and turn them back into deterministic actors because
Right.
their value proposition is in their agency.
Yeah. You can't cripple them and say, well, they don't do what we want. You have to give them that autonomy in order to get the results that we're looking for. But that, again, it radically changes how and how frequently and through what mechanisms you're able to manage that risk.
100%. And you have to go beyond access control and permissions and how the system is designed into understanding how configuration works, but also understanding behavior, as you were saying. So it's not just one dimension. It's not even just two dimensions. It's a full 3D understanding of how this agent is designed, how it's supposed to be operating, what kind of guardrails from a design perspective it's supposed to have, how it's supposed to be accessing systems and data. But then another layer is what's it actually doing when it goes out to do its job? What's it actually doing in real life? And I think that's the hardest piece for the business to get their hands around because we're really used to the first dimension and we're somewhat comfortable with the second dimension. But when you get to that third dimension, you're like, oh my goodness, Scotty B, I don't know how to deal with this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the core shift, as I try to explain it, is we're moving from software that runs to software that acts. And I think that's something that a lot of CISOs are struggling to keep up with. I know I did certainly as well. So to be empathetic to my fellow CISOs.
Well, exactly. And so in that vein of empathy, how do you tackle this? How do you explain this to executives? What was the thing that helped you to grab onto this and say, I now understand this and I can explain it to someone who's not me?
Yeah. Um, I like to break it into sort of three phases, and I think this is a very natural evolution with any new technology, but especially when it comes down to something as sweeping as autonomous and agentic AI. Um, you start with confusion, right? Everyone starts with confusion, whether it was the release of commercial LLMs or understanding what's the difference between AI and agentic AI. Um, and we'll fall back to first principles. It's a very human thing to do. Is this just another SaaS integration? Is this just a software problem? I have software controls, as you mentioned a moment ago. I've dealt with identity and access controls, maybe not very well, but we have some strictures in which we can approach that. And then you start to realize the limits of that understanding, and that's where the confusion comes in. But you do find commonalities, and that's where you move to the second stage of some realization, right? Where you say, oh, okay, there is identity still involved here. There are APIs. Okay, we've struggled to manage APIs for years, but that it's at least a known problem, and we can fall back to some of the challenges there. And data is always king, right? It's always who can have access to what data, when, and how, and why, and is the data safe, and blah blah blah. That's one of the key things we do as CISOs. So when you have that realization, then you can start to say, okay, well, what is the difference? Going back to identity and access, again, that's, I think, something we've struggled with for a long time. And suddenly you realize, well, hold on. where are these agents getting these privileges? Are they inheriting them from user accounts? Well, that's not right, is it? And then you realize, you start to think, oh, okay, now, okay, we have to have a slightly different model to manage the risk. And that's where you move to the third phase, which is, it's kind of a dirty word, but governance, right? That's the core of what we do. How do we build structures in place so that we have a good understanding of what the risk is, what the bounds are? How do we build guardrails around, so that it's easy to make the right choices and difficult but not impossible to break glass? That's the core of what CISOs do to manage risk. So when you move into that governance phase, that third phase, you've gone through that realization. You've understood that agents are a new class of identity, a new class of digital actor. They're not humans. They're not non-human identities. We were trying to use that phrase for a while, which really meant system accounts and things like that. There's this whole new class. So, I have to have different models. So I think and again, that's where the benefit of having gone through, the rigmarole of many, many years of governance to manage risk, that becomes our strength as CISOs, because we understand, oh, well, I need an inventory. I have to understand, where are these agents? What can they do? Right. That goes back into the identity piece. And how do I provide oversight? How can it's not magic, right? As you said, there's a fundamental way of which we build up to give these agents the power to take certain actions. But that comes back to, what prompts have I put in? What model weights started, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that gives me a way to build the oversight around them. So if I think of it this way. If you have a system that can call APIs, it can write data, and it can trigger workflows all on its own, that's not automation. That's effectively a new digital employee in your environment. And you have to come up with new governance models to manage that.
100%. And I also think there's a really important point that you touched on there, which is falling back to first principles. When we try to navigate something new, my background's in psychology, so forgive me the tangent, but I think so often the thing that we do, especially when we're in stress or crisis, is we really simplify information. So we go back to the thing that makes the most sense about this. And unfortunately for many people, that's LLMs, which is not a super well understood terra nova in terms of how they work, their spatial reasoning, they're not intellectual reasoning, they're designed around distance and prediction, not accuracy. And so if we use that as our reasoning core and then we flip that into agents, how does that translate to what we need to be worried about? And your governance and your security for model security looked really different and should look really different than it
Mhm,
does for
mhm.
agents, because the amount that's in your control in that virtual shared responsibility model is much different than it is for agents. Because at the end of the day, if you had a bad output from an LLM, you could blame either the prompt or you could blame the LLM. That there's quite a binary way to classify the outcomes. And some of that would sit with the LLM provider to go, hey, you have to worry about hallucinations. Hey, your RAG is terrible. Hey, your training data is not great. And you could kind of very easily delineate between what's my job and what's their job, and what's the thing I can control and what's the thing they can control. But with agents, that whole calculation changes, because all of it sits within your environment. It sits within your infrastructure, and the agents are ultimately acting on your behalf, whether or not you necessarily want them to be. And so thinking about, how do I explain that to executives? How do I make them understand that this is different from just providing an employee chat service? This is a digital worker. It's kind of like a third party contractor with hopefully really clearly outlined goals and a good job description in the form of system prompts. But then they have some delegated decision making where they can say, hey, I'm going to pursue this project in this specific way. And if you don't have an understanding of which accesses they have and how they're behaving, then that third party contractor is a shadow contractor and you don't know exactly what they're doing. And so when it comes to security, I think quite often the conversation shifts to, well, how do we stop? How do we block? How do we change? And it's not because security teams don't want to be innovative. They really do. But it's because at the end of the day, if something goes wrong, it sits with them to go, okay, let's unpick this. Let's fix it. Let's bring it back online. Let's
Yeah.
change. what happened. And so, as a security team, how do you start taking action? So, you mentioned inventory, you mentioned some of the key ways that you can get your hands around behavior. So, making sure that your agentic platforms have logs, let alone that you have them, and some of the ways that you can start to build in governance. Hopefully, governance becomes a happier word in future. But how do you, as a security team, take something away tangibly and go do it?
Well, speaking of dirty words, you mentioned one that we often as CISOs are, if you read between the lines, we're asked to deal with. Who's to blame? Which comes down to authority and accountability and things like that. That is a big part of how we govern things and how we manage risk. So we do that by communicating in two directions, both downwards to our teams. How do I tell my security team what are the risks? What do you spend your limited time, money, human attention on? And that's where we get into the technical details of identity, as we've talked about before. What permissions have been inherited? How do they apply to different systems? Um, and that's, I think that's unfortunately something we haven't solved. Who can truly raise their hand and say, oh, yes, we have a crystal clear asset inventory that's updated on the fly. I don't think many of us can say that. And that problem compounds now that we have this new class of digital actor. So, but assuming you can get that inventory, you can start to understand the identities. That is how I speak to my security teams of, what permissions are available to it on what systems, where is the logging of how those decisions and what resources are pulled into it, what containment abilities do we have so that things don't hop. We're always worried about lateral movement, and it was difficult enough when we were worried about humans doing that, but now you've got a 24/7 team of agents that I can spin up and see if I can use those inherited permissions to move laterally. And then life cycle. Do these agents to do, if I spin up automation, um, I will expect it to sort of run perpetually until the heat death of the universe without changing, and that's not the case with agents. So I do have to manage the life cycle in the same way that I would onboard and offboard employees. But that's only half of the equation. Um, I think the other interesting piece about being a CISO is about the managing upwards to executives. But I want to call out a quick example of something you mentioned. Agents will take your instructions, and they will, to the best of their ability, try to achieve the goals you've set out for them. So if you say, hey, I want to ship this code to production as quickly as possible, if that agent can find a vulnerability in your Jenkins pipeline and exploit it to push the code live to production, isn't that what you asked for? So I think we have to be very, it's like the genie's out of the bottle. We have to be very careful about what we ask for. And that's where the constraints and the containment and things like that become really important for security teams to manage. But doing all that and then finding a way to explain it to sometimes non-technical executives I think it's part of the fun of being a CISO. Some people may disagree, but executives don't want to hear about prompts and model weights and embedding and things like that. They want to hear about operational risk. They want to hear about business outcomes. They want to hear about regulatory exposure, right? Is this going to cost us fines or lose us business or remove our ability to operate in certain geolocations? And as I started with, they care about accountability for decisions because that's the model through which we've managed organizations for hundreds of years, if not thousands. So it looks like automation through a technical lens, but really operationally, we have to think about it as authority, delegated authority. And that gives us a different lens through which to have that two-way conversation.
100%. I would also add, and you actually say this, and I've now adopted it into my own pattern of speech, but if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And I think there's a really big piece around this that it really is important because if you're talking about, what is something I can do today? What can I immediately implement? Well, the first thing is you probably don't have a great understanding of exactly where you have agents. And so if you're turning around to the business to say, yes, I can manage the accountability of these services, yes, I can manage the accountability of these new digital workers, but you don't have any way to track them, you don't have any way to identify them, you don't have any way to understand their behavior, then practically you're left with a huge gap and a huge blind spot that, especially from kind of traditional security tooling and the way that your stack is set up, you're just not going to have those tools at your side to start operating. So what would you do today to go and tackle this?
Well, first of all, I would say that you have to do something today. Security risk is not static. It compounds like interest. So and I've seen this several times where the shift from VMs to containers, the adoption of orchestration tools like Kubernetes, the move to public cloud. The business is always going to be moving ahead. Your engineers are already adopting the tools, so it can be easy to get paralyzed about what do I do, where do I start? Pick something. Um, but the real risks there are you're going to lose the arms race when it comes to shadow adoption, where teams just start experimenting. Um, these tools are very quickly going to be embedded in existing workflows or start to replace those workflows, and those workflows are business operations, and that is a way that we have to be able to. And again, in that dual facing role as CISOs, we have to understand the business operations, and then we have to be able to talk up to executives about, I'm trying to give you the tools to manage the business. And then, we've always worried about privileges, and we've always worried about who has the ability to do what. That's an area that has just expanded so rapidly. So start today, because the longer an agent runs in your environment, the more authority it will quickly accumulate. And again, that risk just compounds. So to take a real life example, I am not a, I think you can bifurcate it slightly, and you can say, if our product is software, if we are selling software, then that's the thing we can't get wrong. And you can sort of draw a line, and you can say, how do I manage our production environment? How do I help engineers make good decisions? How do I build those guardrails into our existing pipelines and things like that? And guardrails, not gates, right? You can't stand in front of the train. You're going to lose that fight, but you do have to find a way to make it easy to make the right decisions. And I think that's the core of governance. But maybe the risk of your corporate environment and the adoption of LLMs, maybe that's something you tackle second, because we only have so much time, and you have to make those tough calls and relentlessly prioritize. But I think the double-edged sword, to pick a very specific place to start, is we've always been losing the red team versus blue team arms race. And that is just compounded dramatically with the adoption of agentic AI. So attackers are using agentic systems. Don't sleep on that. Don't. It's a negative, in fact, in regards to the fact that you can be attacked 24/7 in a way you couldn't, constrained by time and money, et cetera. But it's also an advantage, because yes, attackers can compress dwell time, but agents can also help you. They can give you, they sort of put proof to the lie that the perimeter defense has never worked. And that whole idea of, if we just build a high enough wall and keep the bad guys out, we're mostly safe. It's never worked, right? The call is coming from inside the house more than it ever has before. So, agents can run on, inside SaaS, inside CI/CD, inside workflow tools. So the thing that agentic AI forces us to do, but it helps in terms of a risk perspective. It helps us take that, that internal attacker mindset of, we can't just have that perimeter defense model of keeping bad guys out. And if someone's inside, then they should have access to everything, and enhanced permissions. We really have to start from that zero trust, from zero data retention. So if you were to take one action this quarter, get the agent image, get your agentic AI inventory done. And that can include the agent name, the platform, its purpose or defined purpose at least, who owns it, right? Who's the owner? Going back to accountability, what data does it have access to? What systems does it have what permissions on? And does it have, well, I'm sure it probably does, what external API access does it have? So you can't manage what you can't measure. You can't control what you don't have visibility over. So the first step has to be visibility. That's the foundation. If you start there, and honestly, it's never been easy to do this manually with a spreadsheet to track these things. You have to adopt some sort of tool, I think, that can shine a light on where are these, how many agents are on my systems, what can they access, what can they retrieve, who owns them. Um, but you've got to find a tool that will help you do a little more than that and go a little deeper than an asset inventory, because the logging and governance gaps are quickly exposed with agentic AI. The decisions that those agents are making, are they logged? Um, how would I actually prove through an audit trail how and when and why, those decisions were made? And what sort of governance do I have over, APIs and things like that? So I think an inventory is good, control over agents is good, but I think the important thing to remember is this is not just another technology adoption for automation. This is really the purposeful introduction of autonomous actors inside the perimeter. We've made that decision. The horse is out of the gate. So I, I don't think any organization can succeed if they try to block that. You're going to lose that race either just through technical inability, or you're going to lose to your competitors who are adopting stronger and faster. I think the organizations that will win this race are the ones who commit early to governance, to doing it intelligently, and to starting with visibility. Treat agents like identities, like entities, and bake the governance in as you scale. It's much easier than to trying to bolt it on after you've already built everything.
I couldn't agree more. That was such a great way to end this. Thank you so much for your time, Terry. I know that so many people get loads out of this, and I can't wait to chat with you again.
Thank you so much, Hannah. It's great to be here.